What's up, team? Welcome to Wealth with Kai, and today we're going to cover some early stage things you can look into before buying a home or developing an existing property in Auckland. Before we get started though, as always, this video is for entertainment purposes only, so please do not treat anything that I say or show in this video as financial advice. Let's get right into it because I've whipped out my entertainment shades. So, you've pulled together a little bit of money, maybe by yourself, through the bank, or chipping together with friends and family, so you can all look to take another step on the property ladder. If it's your first time especially, how do you know what to look for in a house to develop or buy to live in? Or how do you even know it's possible to develop the house that you have your eyes on? Well, that's what I'm here for today. So in part 1 of developing a property in Auckland, we're going to look at some preliminary things that you can explore before committing a fat ton of cash into a home. I won't be including the financial element in this video, but in part 2 or part 3, I plan on having a video that theoretically breaks down all the finances involved when you buy and develop a property. I've also broken down this video into 4 main parts, some of which is relevant to first home buyers, others may not be as relevant. Firstly, we're going to have a look and overview of the Auckland Unitary plan. After that, we'll emphasize the importance of location as well as infrastructure before finishing off and going into some potential challenges that you might not be aware of, using a sweet tool that I like to use called Geomaps. Let's get right into it. So firstly, what is the Auckland Unitary Plan and why should you care about it for developing? The plan is essentially a guide of the do's and don'ts in land development by controlling what can be built where. This color-coded map represents, let me just get my laser pointer in. But this color-coded map over here essentially represents the different zones that Auckland properties can fall under. For example, some places you can build factories, other places you can only build homes. And this is generally determined through consideration of some social, natural, infrastructural, economical, and environmental factors that's situated around Auckland. More on this shortly. I've shown in the slides here also some of the things that the Auckland Unitary Plan covers in terms of the rules and the do's and don'ts, but generally speaking, you don't have to worry too much about these because experts such as planners, engineers, and architects that you hire for your job will generally provide all the guidance that you need. So, one good preliminary check for a home that you're interested in is seeing what zone the property falls under. The Auckland Unitary Plan essentially splits different areas around Auckland into these zones, as I mentioned in that color-coded map, and each zone has differences on what you can and can't do with the land. There are many different zones such as business, industrial, residential and rural, etc. But if you're looking to develop, you generally want to look for a residential zone property that's not under-ruled as a rural zone jurisdiction such as a farm, and you also want to avoid the single house zones, where chances of you developing it is low because a single house, as it says in its name, generally means you can only have a single house on that parcel of land. On my slides over here, I've listed the 3 main zones that are popular among development for residential purposes, which I'll cover briefly. For the mixed housing zones, there is mixed housing urban and mixed housing suburban. In terms of development, the main difference between urban and suburban is the height your property can be. The suburban zone generally allows up to 2 stories to maintain its more widespread and suburban character, whereas in the urban zone, dwellings can reach 3 stories. You can also do 3-story dwellings in the suburban zones, but there's generally conditions around it that a planner can give you more advice on. So on the left-hand side of the slides over here are some examples of terrace houses that you can build in these mixed housing zones. Now, the terrace housing and apartment building zone, THAB for short, is a more high-intensity zone, and these zones are generally located near metro areas or town centers where there is sufficient infrastructure such as public transport to support higher levels of intensification and populations. Now, these buildings can generally go up to between 5 to 7 stories. In this zone, you can build homes similar to the ones on the left-hand side, or turn it up a notch and have apartment complexes similar to this right-hand side. So, considering your budget and scope for development, knowing the zone type early on can give you a heads up to some things you can and can't do for development. Obviously, there's a lot more rules associated with these zones, but experts can generally handle that, or you could read more into these zones in your own time. Now, if we take a very big step back and think about how much more intensification is to occur in Auckland largely based on this plan, where you demolish one home and build 4 to 10 dwellings in its place, homes that are yet to be developed with a good amount of land will become more and more rare, and that generally drives up the price of these homes, as firstly, developers would want to acquire these homes to develop it, and people who want the extra land and yard space will have to compete for it against the developers. As a general market rule of thumb, supply doesn't meet demand, and with Auckland's population projected to increase, my argument is that house prices won't go down, but instead steadilize or generally still trend upwards. Although this makes homes a potentially lucrative investment, I'm personally not a big fan of it because it is absolutely ridiculous how much harder people have to work and save to afford a place to live and call home. And that 1 or 2 generations ago, or maybe even just 2 to 10 years ago, people were able to obtain homes with relative ease, compared to us of course. In my personal opinion, a lot of this lead up is unfortunately due to the poor decision making by some of the people before us, and the human construct and unsustainable system in place as a result of these decisions, and greed especially. Although I don't like this system, I do what I can for myself, and hopefully I can provide some guidance and insight for you guys that are looking to get a step on the property ladder. Please don't hate the player, hate the game, sorry for the mini rant, let's move on. So, back to the zoning. There are many different ways which you can figure out what zone a property is in, but what has been the most convenient for me is using a website called relab.co.nz. The website does have a free version, and I've linked it in the video description below. I am not sponsored by the way, but typing in the address for the site of interest on this website can give you some access to tools that will help you with your development or purchase decision. As you can see on my slides, the website generally gives a pretty good overview of the land size, whether it's a freehold property or not, as well as the legal description, which I've blurred out over here, as well as the zone, which I've mentioned earlier, as well as its council valuation, which generally gets updated every 3 years. And yeah, let's keep moving on. The site also provides things like its own personal valuation, which I've unfortunately left off the slides. Also gives a general summary of the property, as well as the school zoning and demographics in the area, age breakdown, as well as the household income. So all in all, it's a very useful site to find preliminary information on the property. Personally speaking though, I like looking for freehold sites with areas that's greater than 600 meters squared, just so you can develop hopefully at least 3 dwellings, if not more. Depending on if you want to develop the existing home straight away by demolishing the existing home, or rent it out a few years just so you could save up money for your development, or maybe even live in it yourself for your first home buyers, you also want to look at the general condition of the home, its property files, building report, and whether it will comply with healthy home standards. Additionally, there may be some extra expenses you need to prepare for, such as renovating if it does not comply with these standards. Obviously, if your plan is to tear down and develop the home down the line, you want to limit how much you put into renovation. 3 really key things when looking for a place to buy, which is emphasized ridiculously already, is location, location, and location. Some things on this front may seem very obvious, but it is often overlooked, so I'll give a quick broad cover of some things I personally think about. This section is also especially relevant to first home buyers. Firstly, there's school zoning. Great schools with great deciles will attract parents that are willing to pay an extra premium so their kids can walk or take the bus to school in a safe community, receive arguably better education, and meet more like-minded kids and teachers. So not just the school zoning in itself, but the community, as well as especially the access to the school, is very important. There's a big difference between a kid confidently walking to school safely by themselves every single day without the parent's concern or worry, compared to a parent having to drive and drop off the kid every single day in fear of high traffic roads and cars in case of accidents, or dangerous community in general, or the long distance it may take for the kid to walk if he or she or they were to walk. Amenities as well, such as grocery stores, public parks, are things that many people will take for granted. You may also want to consider the overall safety of the area. Sometimes if there's a lot of state housing in the vicinity, people may be turned off by the idea of living nearby. Public transport convenience or closeness to work areas often plays a big part into why a person would live in a home. The list for this can actually go on, but it's important to bear in mind that everyone has needs when looking for a place to live, and the more boxes you can tick, the more people you will attract, and then the more people will be willing to pay when you rent or sell the developed homes. Some methods I use when thinking about this stuff is going on Relab, going on Google Maps to see what's around, personally taking a walk in the neighborhood when going on the open home, as well as putting myself in the shoes of the buyer and homeowner and considering what happens if I was to live there. Now, that was a broad overview of location, but what about infrastructure, utilities, and potential challenges with different sites when developing? Building new homes likely means you'll need to make sure each house has a way to connect to existing services such as power, wastewater, internet, etc. But generally speaking, if you're developing in a brownfield area where infrastructure is already relatively established, utilities shouldn't be too much of an issue. Because of this, it's just nice to have a preliminary understanding of the stuff and then leave it to the professional experts that will develop your site. Additionally, some homes can also be prone to risks, which you might want to make a mental note of because risks generally require mitigation, and mitigation generally means more costs involved in the development. Some risks can include geotech, which is related to the soil and the ground and the foundations, or flood risk, which is how risky it is for your site to potentially become flooded. A very useful site I like to use for these utilities as well as the risks is called Geomaps. It has a lot of different things you can look into to help you inform of your development decision. I'll have a link for it down in the video description below, but what better way to talk about it than to use it and to show you in this video. So let's get into that. Awesome, my camera has bugged out, but I still have the sunglasses on, so bear in mind this video is still for entertainment purposes only. So just before, we've covered some of the general things to look into for homes, such as the school zones as well as amenities in the area. Now, we're going to look at some of the more site-specific things, and a good tool of that to explore some of these stuff is Geomaps. I'll cover some of the things to explore for first in these slides, and then conclude the video before having a quick tutorial on how to navigate Geomaps for those that are still interested. I feel like once I've covered these elements, you can then consult with a professional before purchasing the property if that is what you desire. Now, my first example is regarding the driveway and site shape. Long driveways, especially if they are skinny, are generally a no-go for me. Think about it, you're going to demolish the house, build many in its place, and expect multiple families to share that skinny road/driveway daily. I highly doubt an engineer can easily design around this, and even if they can, you won't get a good price for your developments because buyers won't be flocking to a house with such a skinny long driveway that they might use for a very long time. Also, while you're developing, construction traffic coming in and out throughout the entire process will be a ridiculous hassle. You guys get the idea. I have a couple examples over here. The first one is one that's outlined in blue. You can see that this driveway is ridiculously skinny and would probably require upgrading, but you won't know how because it's not your land, and people just getting into this site here will be ridiculously hard. The second example here is two long driveways right next to each other, so what you can do is purchase both these houses, so then you have a wider driveway, but either way, you'll be driving in really deeply to service these 20 to 30 new homes. Maybe, I don't know, 20 was just a random number, don't quote me on it, but yeah, a lot of homes, and all these people have to share this all the time as well as walk this every single time they go for a nice walk or head out on their feet. Now, secondly, a rectangular shaped property is ideal because they're the easiest to design around and they utilize the land the most. On the right hand side over here, these aren't actually as bad as they can get, but the irregular shaped land parcels generally mean you can't fully optimize all the land space and it will cost more to design around. So although this example here isn't too weird, essentially my rule of thumb is the weirder the shape of the property, the worse it is. Just if you have a look over here, this triangle section at the end, it's going to be kind of hard for designers and planners to accommodate like a nice sized or comfortable looking home when you also incorporate all the other driveways and all the other homes that we built in the area. Just as a side note, it's kind of interesting. You can see that there's two separate parcels for 13 and 15, one over here and one over here. But one house seems to overlap two of them. So maybe this house covers two parcels, or maybe they've split it and somehow there's two families sharing either way. Well, random off tangent, but just, yeah, a random observation I just noticed right now. Now, the next thing I want to cover is the steepness and contours of the site. The contours are represented by these yellow lines that you can see in the picture on Geomaps, and the steeper the site, the less I prefer it. Obviously, you can visually go assess the steepness when you go to an open home, but for those that want to have an earlier look but can't read contours, the rule of thumb is the closer that the lines are together, the steeper the place is. So on the left over here, you can see the area is quite flat, the lines are quite dispersed apart. Essentially, there is not even a single line on this property over here. And over here, you can see there's a lot more lines, which means the steepness is a lot more ridiculous, and generally, I would not prefer it. A steeper site generally means more cost for development because there will be more earthworks involved, more health and safety measures, and there's also will be more stricter assessments in what you can build, and that will need to be backed up by geotechnical designs as well as a geography report. Also, just personally, if you're walking and driving up steep slopes all the time, and especially if you have to share it with other people, it just becomes a hassle that I'm not happy to put up with. Next up is noise. As you can see here, these homes are located near the motorway, which is generally really loud and can be a turn off for some people. It's not as much of a biggie as the others, but something to bear in mind that if you buy a home near a high use road, or maybe like a train track where there's trains running every 5 minutes during rush hour, it can annoy a lot of people. Even on the weekends when there's just a train maybe every 30 minutes, imagine you're just enjoying a nap or whatever, and then a train goes vroom vroom behind your house and it kind of kills the vibe. Now, the next thing I have to cover is the infrastructure connections as well as risks. So this stuff you generally leave it to the professionals and it gets really confusing. So for this element, you mainly just have to look at it at a very high level and then seek expertise on the matter. So one big cost with development is how you connect your site to things like stormwater, wastewater, as well as water supply. Now in this middle, this site has already been developed, and likely they were able to utilize the existing public network connections that were already in place and simply just extend these networks onto their development site. For those that don't know, the red pipes represent any wastewater stuff, so that's like your toilet, your dishwasher, and what things connect to that. The green represents stormwater, so when it rains, how does this water get discharged off your property without causing flooding? And water supply is how you get your drinking water and all the water that you use for your showers and stuff before it becomes wastewater. Now, so if you look at the right hand side property, this one over here, you can see that there is a wastewater network on the site, which is good news. Hopefully your engineer can just be like, boom, we could connect right on. But you do see, however, there is no stormwater pipe in the network. That likely means you'll have to dig up this driveway and then extend it out over the footpath and connect to this existing green line over here. Now, there's probably like a lot of other options you can explore, but I'm not the expert on the matter, so this is just my preliminary thought, so please do not take my word for it. Also, if you have a good think about why is there no stormwater on this existing network site already, it's mainly because these houses are quite old, and back then they probably didn't think about all the stormwater challenges that we have expertise on nowadays. Now, there's also this left-hand picture over here, and that might mislead you, because as you can see, there is no stormwater network. However, this area is kind of near Sandringham, and in those areas, there's a lot of volcanic rock that can absorb water really well, so the public network in that area comprises of some soakage systems. Overall though, as I said, your engineer would know a lot more than me, and don't stress too much on these, but however, there is no harm in having a quick look. Another note with this picture is these random blue areas that you could see, blobs over here, little patches here, as well as here. These represent flood risks, and when this shows up on your property, you'll need to have a professional engineer do a flood assessment to see how bad it is, and these can potentially introduce constraints and costs to the site development. Again, it's just good for a preliminary look, and after that, just leave it to the professionals. Overall though, just to conclude everything and as a disclaimer, it's rare for a property to tick all the boxes that I've mentioned, and this video is just a rough guide, so please do your own due diligence, and homes don't need to tick every box that I talk about for them to be a good home to live in yourself or to develop. There will always be compromises, so don't let one of these things put you off from the fact that it may tick everything else. So, to conclude the video, we've covered the Auckland Unitary plan and its zoning. We also went over a couple of useful resources, Relab for the high-level consideration, and Geomaps for the site-specific information. We talk about some amenities as well as the importance of location, and then concluded with looking at some potential challenges and things to look out for with different sites as examples. In the future parts of this series, these are some of the things that I hope to cover. So firstly, maybe who to consult right before or right after buying the house, as well as a full financial breakdown, which I talked about at the start of the video. We can also talk about the construction process from the very start, such as a resource consent, all the way up to the sale and rental of the property, and then also what is the pros and cons of renting/selling once you've developed or bought an investment home. Now, I'll quickly restart my stream, get my camera working, and let's have a quick run over the Geomaps tutorial if you're still interested. Awesome, so when you first go on Geomaps, there will be a terms and conditions that you just have to accept. Once you do that, just go in here and just search a random address. For the purposes of this, I will just type a random number and hopefully something comes up. 198. There's a few options here. Auckland Central, not really ideal. Pukekohe is a bit far away. Waiheke, let's go with the first option. That leads us to around the Glen Innes area. I just realized this property over here is kind of like a cross lease. So it doesn't really give us the information we're looking for. Let's just scroll across a bit and say we searched 154 instead. So it gives you some preliminary information over here. It's general area, legal description, address, etc. But that are the stuff that we're not really interested in. What you would do is you click on the second box over here and you switch over to assets. Assets is the main layer that I believe has the most relevant information, and after that it will produce a legend with some stuff that you could tick and look into yourself. After that, I normally go into this first icon here and click the aerial base map instead, just so it gives us a nice aerial view. So if you just look at the general site, it is a rectangular shape, which is ideal. Let's turn on the contours. So you just tick this button over here and you can see there's not a single orange line that intersects the site, which means the area is very, very flat, which is also another green flag in my books. If we scroll across a bit, just to have a better idea of the area, you can see, this area it does become a bit more steep, but that's just heading into what seems like a reserve. So yeah, overall we picked a pretty flat area to do our analysis on. Next, I would like to have a look at the underground services. So that's the whole stormwater, wastewater things I talked about earlier. I wouldn't worry too much about the rest of them down here. Things such as fiber optic, you could just easily search online using the Chorus website, and there's not a lot of stress involved with installing that stuff. And generally, Geomaps has not updated to include the fiber optic cable layer. Also, you don't need to worry stuff about gas and things as well, just because the government is essentially trying to phase this stuff out by 2050 because of the whole climate change agreement, blah 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 blah, which I'm actually not too familiar on. So looking at the site over here, you can see it has a wastewater line running across the site, which is pretty good news. That means when you develop, hopefully your civil engineer can just be like, yep, we could just connect directly onto that. That's a good sign. However, the stormwater appears to be on the other side of the road. So what that means is you might potentially have to either do some roadworks, which is actually a lot more extra cost associated with development, and do an underground pipe through and connect to this pipe over here. Or alternatively, if you can get neighborhood approval back here, you could look at getting a line along underground over here, but it seems like there's a mini road as well. So either way, if you were to pick this site, you would have to do some potential roadworks. Another option might be to somehow link this to this line over here. I think that's a catch pit, so it's the drains that essentially capture all the runoff from the road. Now you might be first wondering, why is there no existing stormwater connection for the site? My theory is, it might be wrong, is that these houses were built in the 1900s, And because they're built in the 1900s, back then they didn't really care or consider too much about stormwater. And as years go by, our understanding of stormwater has increased, and our infrastructure and regulations around stormwater has also improved. And that generally means nowadays every single house needs a method of disposing stormwater, whether that be through the soakage system that I described earlier or through connection to the public network like so. Now, moving on to the next element. So underground services, we might need to query our engineer before we buy the site whether it is easy to connect to these existing services. Water, pretty straightforward. Seems like there's a blue line running along here which you could just connect onto your site. Next, you might want to look at the catchments and hydrology. That layer, I tick everything except the bottom two, and that generally shows some of the flood risks I talk about. Fortunately for our site, it seems like, you can see some overland flow paths there, but it doesn't cross our site, as well as the floodplain blobs don't really touch our site either. That is a good thing, so we don't need to worry much about the flooding elements. And because the site is flat, we don't need to worry about the geotech, so it's just all the preliminary stuff for this site we have kind of covered in my books. So if we just maybe move around a bit and see what we can spot in terms of the other things and whether other sites might have some constraints that we could look into a bit more in detail. I am conscious this video is very long, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. Let's zoom out a little bit. So yeah, all these houses that's in this floodplain would need a flood assessment. Let's see if we can spot somewhere that has already developed within this area. Oh, here's a pretty good example. Let's wait for the layer to buffer itself, or just turn it off and on again. Yep, so as you can see, it was likely these houses were like demolished, or this was just green area, and you can see that a lot of subdivision has happened, or might have already happened. The aerials just haven't updated, but they essentially split this area into a pretty big development. And part of this development, they would have had to do some connections to the existing infrastructure. Chances are they kind of just utilize what's existing and then connected to it. But as you can see, it gets really complicated, and for this purposes of this video, I don't think I should go into it in too much detail. But yeah, as you can see, you have to connect to the network, and for our original site in mind, we need to figure out a way. Say you demolish this house, build 4 in its place, 5 in its place, how are you going to connect to its network? So that's kind of overview of Geomaps. Other things that you can do is use the measuring tool, so you could draw out shapes to see approximate lengths or areas of different things. Sorry, I did not use that properly, but say if I draw, why is it not letting me click? Oh, there we go. Draw out a shape. We can find out its area perimeter. You could change the color as well as the text. You can't really read that well, so if we change that to white, you might be able to see it better. You also draw lines to measure lengths if you want to do that. And one other tool is you can also extract information as well. You could extract information, but that's for design purposes, so don't worry too much about that. And the only other thing maybe you want to pay attention to is if there's a particular thing you want to have specific information on, you click on this information icon, and you just click on the property, and it'll give you the property. Or if you click on the contour line, it'll automatically go to the property, but you can go down here, drop down, go to the contour, and see what elevation it's at and what year it was produced. Finally, there's also this eye icon. So say you have everything ticked and you still don't know what you're looking for, but you want to know the geography of the site. You can go geotech, you can add that layer and go to the legend, tick that, and tick the relevant one you want. Also, another one that's relatively popular is the planning one, which I think is called management. And what you can do with that, you add that layer and you go in the legend, management, and you go over the controls. So that's some of the rules that apply in the AUP. And you can see suddenly our site is filled with some blue plus signs. That likely represents a SMAF zone, which I won't go into detail, but it does introduce potential additional costs with your development. Now, that is all I have for today. Hopefully you have a good understanding of Geomaps and how to use it when you have a site that you're interested in for development. That is all for today, and thank you all for tuning in. Remember to comment, like, and subscribe if you had a good time, and I also have referral links down below for those that want to start their investment journey. All referrals will contribute towards a public portfolio that will be released very, very shortly. Entertainment shades are now off, and I'll see you guys all next time.